So Unit 3 is all about ancient history. We start with, actually before history, before the Neolithic Revolution, and then we get into the origins of the very first civilizations. In this unit, you should ask yourself 2 questions throughout. They're going to be themes. You're probably going to have to write about one or the other at some point. 1, was the Neolithic Revolution a good thing or a bad thing? And 2, how did physical geography shape the development of early states, like river valley civilizations that we're going to talk about? So this should be a fun unit. This is a unit that requires some notes, though. When we get into history, as you'll see in just a sec, it's a lot of not just vocabulary, but also cause and effect, compare and contrast, stuff that you actually do need to write down in order to process any of it. So if you've been trying to skate by without taking notes up to this point, I strongly urge you to stop and trust me and write things down. If you write things down, you will remember them. If you don't, it's going to be really, really, really hard. Writing things down, though, doesn't have to be terrible or lengthy or painstaking in any way, shape, or form. When we start this unit, I'm going to try to put in pictures of examples from notes from classes from, way back in the day. This one on the screen is from 2016, and I'd like for you guys to look at it because it is a page of notes from this very same lesson containing the very same information that I'm about to give you. And I want you guys to see how effectively you can write down a lot of information by using pictures and diagrams and, cause to effect arrows and stuff like that. When we go through the key points, you're going to see a lot of text on the slides. So I wanted to really emphasize that you can get all of that text and a lot of that information in not very much space when you use pictures and the like. All right, so let's start with the do first, which I will paste into the chat too. Okay, the do first is as follows. The story of your life is going to be written by somebody. For this important task, you can choose between your mother and your worst enemy to write the story of your life. Who do you choose and why? So, give you a couple minutes. Let's see what you pick. You can raise your hand to answer this question out loud, or you guys can type it in the chat. You can tell me just who you'd pick. If you want to be extra and go over the top, you can tell me why too. I'll give you guys about 30 seconds and then ask y'all to hit enter. Halima says her mother. Hector says his worst enemy. That's interesting. Oh, it's okay. You guys can hit enter. It's fine. And my PowerPoint stopped working on my end, so I am going to take this opportunity to represent it, and hopefully it'll work. In the meantime, we've got lots of people saying their mother, one person saying their worst enemy, and I'm wondering if anyone, could give me an indication of why it is you chose the person you chose. Why your mom? Halima, go ahead and Halima first, then Peace. You guys can unmute and then let me know. So Halima first.
I said my mom because out of everyone in this world, she knows the most about me.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, right? So your mom would have the most information, she'd have the best context, you think, to write a pretty realistic story. Makes sense. How about Peace? What did you say?
I had something similar to Halima. I put my mom because I feel like she knows me the best.
Okay. So what you guys are saying in different words is that one of these two options has a lot more context to give a picture, more real picture of your life. Hector, I want to know why you picked the worst enemy. I'm pretty sure it's going to be an interesting answer. I'm not going to put you on the spot and make you answer or anything like that, but I am curious. Brave soul.
I just want to know their perspective of me, their point of view. of my worst enemy. I'm not RA. It'd be interesting.
Okay, so that's an awesome answer. So one, that shows that you're a very open-minded person who's open to learning about yourself, which is a great thing to be. But two, you're talking about perspective. So your worst enemy probably already has some sort of like bias against you or some sort of reason to not like you, right? And you're saying that you can learn from that, which is awesome. I know if I had my mom write the story of my life, I would come off as like an angel, and I am not, right? So like on my case, my mom knows a lot about me, but she also has a very biased perspective of my life, and she would probably be nicer than I think real life warrants. What you guys are getting at, right, is that when we write stories about people or history, context matters. Like a person's background information matters, their biases matter, and the story of your life will be different depending on whose perspective is telling it. We start the history part of class like this for the very good reason that history works the exact same way. History, like a lot of students tend to think that when they're going to learn history, they're going to memorize a bunch of names and a bunch of dates that they don't really care about, and that's the whole deal. And it's actually not that at all. That's a great mark of a terrible history class. Actual classes, like the one you guys are going to get, are a lot more about thinking about interpretation and different points of view, and how different points of view can lead people to tell different versions of the same story. So we're going to get into all of that vocabulary today. We also had a couple of other questions. I don't think we have a ton of time to go into them, but I'll kind of go over kind of the point of why I asked you them to begin with real quick. So y'all were asked why you think scribes were in positions of power for most of human history, back when only a few people could read and write. Scribes are people who wrote things down like for a living. The next question leads to the same point. What is the relationship between the way history is recorded, or who gets to write the story, and power? And then to drive this point home, I'm sure some of you have had this experience personally, but imagine you get in really, really, really big trouble in school, like really big trouble, and you know your teacher's going to call home, and it's like a Friday, and it's going to ruin your whole weekend if the teacher talks to your parents first. And I'm sure you've all had the impulse, if you've gotten in big, big trouble before, to tell your mom or your dad or your parents your side of the story first before the teacher gets a chance to call, because the first person to tell the story has kind of the advantage of framing the whole thing. History is like this too. People who leave sources that historians use are usually people with some sort of power to write the story that we're learning. That means that they hide some perspectives that we also need to be looking for. And the way we tell a story matters. And we don't all tell stories the same way. It's pretty clear to me that you guys have an intuitive understanding of how this works. And today we're just going to talk about a little bit of basic vocabulary that historians use, and how this idea that people tell stories differently, and you can probably get a version of the truth by reading lots of different versions of the same event, how that applies to history and studying it and learning it. So without further ado, we are going to start taking notes. Please get out a paper wherever you've been taking notes. You're not writing down everything on the slide. I'll tell you what to write down in just a second. And then in the meantime, Halima, if you have a question or a comment, you can unmute yourself and enlighten us. And otherwise you can, lower your hand. Okay. Pasting this in the chat too, so I don't forget about people. So I'm going to go over a couple of definitions with y'all. I want you to write the first two on the slide down, and then the others, if there's anything that is new to you or particularly interesting to you, you can write it down, but then you don't really have to. The first two, yes, though, because we're going to be using definitions that are maybe a little bit more precise than you're used to. Starting with history. History is the study of the past. But not the whole thing, actually. As it turns out, history is the study of the past starting when written records first become available, when people settled, specialized enough to have people learn how to write a language, and we can find those records and learn from them. Up to now. The reason for that is that written records are our clearest, best evidence for what the past would have been like. Before history, before the written records available, we call that time prehistory, and we know about that time from things called artifacts, which are literally objects like clay pots and weapons and stuff like that. And history is primarily about chronology, which describes the order in which things occur. You can see it on a timeline. If you're not super familiar with how timelines work already, please draw yourself one in your notes. You'll notice on the left, it says BC. It really should say BCE. That stands for before Christ. Nowadays we use BCE, before the Christian era, because not everybody's Christian and it's kind of, I don't know, non-inclusive way of measuring time if you just assume everybody's Christian and count that way. That is the time before the year zero. The number zero actually hadn't even been invented at the time the year zero would have been, but that's a discussion for another day. On the right, you'll notice it says CE/AD. Back in the day, people used to refer to this time as after death, referring to the death of Jesus Christ. Again, now because we know that not everybody's Christian and we don't want to impose that timeline on everybody, we use CE for the common era or the Christian era, depending on who you ask. History is not just about what happened and when and in what order, though that would be super boring. What historians are mostly interested in is getting a sense of the feeling of the time, like as deeply as possible. What was the past like? What would have been like to live there? How the context of the past shaped the way that people lived and thought and made decisions. And the more you use your imagination in history, the better it becomes. A lot about cause and what happens as a result. And cause and effect, it sounds like the kind of thing that you'd have to memorize, but actually cause and effect is all about interpretation. You can have many different historians citing many different causes for the same event, and they can all be right. But again, it's a question of perspective. Historians are very interested in finding patterns in history, largely through comparing and contrasting. Right? We're going through a time period in history where if you are at all interested in following the news, you'll see a lot of comparisons to a lot of honestly scary times from the past. And historians do a lot of like thinking about what's similar and what's different to kind of be able to use the past now to make better decisions. But that's not all, because history is not a science. We don't have precise evidence. We can't go out and like measure history with an objective device. So we also have to be interested in where our evidence is coming from, how our evidence was made, how reliable it is, based on the points of view and the biases and the context of the time and the place, and how all of those things shape the perspective of whoever is leaving us written evidence, and therefore our accounts of history, and therefore how different stories get told. We'll go more into that in just a second. The point is, history is all about interpretation. There are many stories of the past. There are many different perspectives of what the past would have been like. And history is all about finding a method and getting good at it in order to make sense of the past in a way that's as close to accurate as we possibly can get. So, and again, pay attention to how the notes on the left neatly summarize all of the information that I'm going through in pictures. It's a skill that you can develop. All right, so like we said, history is the study of the past starting from writing being available up to now, because written sources are the best, most detailed evidence that we have of what the past would have been like. Historians use written sources to write stories about the past that are called narratives. True stories about the past, or as close to true as we can get. They don't just make things up. And historians build their narratives from two different kinds of sources, and the difference or the distinction between the two is super duper important. Historians get their information from primary sources and from secondary sources, and I'm about to tell you what those are and why they're different. All right, starting with primary sources. Primary sources are the most direct evidence that we have left from a specific time. Halima, do you have a question?
Sorry. I'm sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay. Yeah. One of these days you'll have a question. All right, so primary sources come from the time a historian is studying. That means, like, if I'm interested in ancient Rome, a primary source would be made around, I don't know, the year 4 BC, or whatever. They're written during the time a historian is studying, and they provide our most direct evidence of the past. Usually these sources are created, like the slide says regular people, but it's not regular people. It's people with enough power and education to leave written sources. And for most of history, that has not included everybody. Notably, women, slaves, people who can't read and write, people who just got conquered, people without enough power to write a source. They tend to remain outside of the official record of history, so we have to work extra hard to figure out what life would have been like for them. On the other hand, you have people like kings, priests, upper class people. They tend to leave a ton of sources. So most of what we know of history comes from their points of view. And these sources are like diaries, they could be laws, they could be records of, I don't know, sales at a little shop of weapons or whatever. I don't know, making it up, but you guys get the idea. Importantly, with primary sources, our primary source of evidence from the past. Primary sources are first-hand accounts of what happened, but like everything else, they contain biases that come from the point of view of whoever produced the source. So you wouldn't look to a king's diary to understand what life would have been like for a peasant. You would not get an accurate picture. Kings and peasants didn't tend to mingle. So even though it is our evidence, we still have to be super careful about how we apply what is in it, because it's not always super true. Much like the example in the Do First, if a historian was looking at your primary source letter to your mother about why the teacher got mad at you that day, it would kind of probably be a skewed account that worked in your favor, right? And it's like that for everything. So you have to be careful. All right, the top of this slide contains information that we've already gone over. I just added it again so that if you are catching up with your writing, you don't freak out when I change slides. We are going to talk about secondary sources next. So primary sources come from the past. They're left by people that we're studying in the much distant future. They're our most direct evidence that we have. Secondary sources are what they sound like. They are secondary. They come after. They are indirect references to what happened in the past. So secondary sources are references written about the time period that we or a historian or anyone is studying, usually written by another historian or an academic long after the events that they are about took place. You can think of these as like textbooks. or reference books. Historians use these to look up information, and when they write narratives based on primary sources, the historian's narrative becomes a secondary source that others can use to learn about the past. We have to be careful with these too, because just like primary sources, secondary sources reflect the biases and the points of view and the interpretation of the person who wrote them. It's not an exact science. And we're going to go through tons of examples of this as the semester rolls on. The reason we have to be careful, again, is these are indirect evidence. They rely on another person's interpretation of primary sources. So a thorough student of history doesn't just read one book about ancient Rome, you read like 5 to get a real sense of what it was like from a couple different points of view. Been using the word bias often, and let's look at what that means. Bias is a prejudice in favor or against a person, group, or point of view. It can be intentional or subconscious. They can be harmless, and they can be harmful. It depends, right? A lot of biases can just reflect the circumstances and experience that a person has growing up and how that informs their point of view. Historians' biases and points of view affect how they interpret the sources that they use to construct their narratives. For example, we are living in a country that has, historically speaking, unusually expansive views of freedom. We're used to being able to practice whatever religion we want, and it's not a problem. And so when we look at history, we might have a different reaction to, I'm trying to think of an example that you guys would really latch onto. From the Do First, like both the mom writing the story of your life and your enemy writing the story of your life, they have different biases. It doesn't mean that your mom's a bad person. It just means that she is probably prone to like you and will probably write a nice story about your life. Your worst enemy, like the bias is in the name, right? It's somebody that doesn't like you, and they're probably going to see mostly negative things about your life if they were to write a story about your life. It doesn't mean that either person is lying. It just means that they see different things based on their perspectives. And to get a full view, you'd want to read both. This leads me to our final concept for the day, historiography. That's going to be a hugely important word for us throughout the semester, and it is a really difficult concept for students to understand the first time they hear it. So write it down anyway. I'm going to define it for you like 3 different ways. If any of the things that I say makes it click, write that down. If nothing clicks, it's fine. I'm going to take care of it in a week. Historiography is the study of how historians' narratives are different from one another and how the stories we tell about the past change over time. Because historians can interpret the past differently, historiography focuses on how history is written, how these narratives are created, and how our interpretations have changed. For example, the historiography of your life would look at both the story that your mom wrote about your life and the story your worst enemy wrote about your life. And then it would think about, like, where do these different perspectives come from? Why do they see different things? This gives us a more full vision, not only about your life, but about the sources themselves. Another way to think of it is it's the study of secondary sources about one topic. So like the historiography of, I don't know, Nazi Germany would include everything that's been written about it by historians, German historians, American historians, Russian historians. all of whom probably saw different things in that really complex event. It's also a way of making sure that we know how to read and trust secondary sources and where to be skeptical of their interpretations. It's kind of like a check on history because history is not an exact science, right? So if I only read one book about your life, it could be a totally biased account and I would never know it unless I read several different books about your life too. That's why we have a whole field of study for like all of those different narratives. The reason we have to have this too, aside from history not being an exact science, is that if you want to know about the past, the best thing to do is to look at primary sources, but there are too many of them for any one person to go through entirely. So we have to rely on secondary sources for what we know. And historiography helps us understand how credible different sources could be. So that was a lot. Here's everything we talked about all on one slide. I'll pop that slide into the chat in case anybody needs to catch up on notes, but I have a question for y'all, more interestingly. And a comment about what this means for our class, right? So you are not gonna memorize dates and names and call it a day and say that you learned history. That is no way to do it. There is no one true story of history. That doesn't mean it's all made up. It just means that we have to be very attentive to how perspective affects the way we tell stories. So instead of learning like the one truth about history, you're going to learn what we know, where that information comes from, and what different historians have thought about that information over time, ideally in the context of their own time. You're allowed to have your own opinion. In fact, that is encouraged. And instead of like memorizing a bunch of names or dates, it is my hope that you will dive deep enough into history to understand why things happen and become curious about what they were like. And you'll find that when you do that, you remember names and dates without even trying. I promise. All right, so up on the slide is a bunch of books that I use to write my history classes, actually. And here's my question for y'all to see if you got it. If a bunch of historians are all writing about the same topic and they all use the same sources, will they all come up with the same narrative? And I'll be super impressed if you can give me a reason to. So give y'all like a minute to type in your answers into the chat and then we can hit enter. All right, y'all can go ahead. If you have a guess, hit enter and let us see it. All right, I can let y'all vote if you want. Ooh, Miguel, did you want to answer? You put your hand down. Oh well.
It was an accident, but I might as well just answer.
Yay, do it.
I say no, because they could see it differently than others. They have different perspectives from one another.
Beautiful, beautiful answer. Peace agrees with you in the chat, and I'm glad you said it because you're totally right. No, because everybody approaches a set of facts from their own perspective and they see them through their own biases. Yes, Peace, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I want to say that, like, it's like, for example, it's like if you search up a question on the internet, you're going to get different answers. Not all the answers are going to be the same.
Yes, beautiful. Yes, perfect. Some answers are just flat out wrong and based on nothing. Some answers have different perspectives, right? And so that's like a great tie-in actually, because history has become a life skill in the sense that if you get good at history, you get good at looking at sources and immediately thinking, are they misleading? Like you think more critically about what you read once you get good at history, which will help you navigate the internet much better, hopefully. All right, so this is why the difference between primary and secondary sources are important. Primary sources help us find facts, though written accounts have their own biases that we need to be aware of too. And then secondary sources are written about a set of facts, filtered through somebody else's points of view and biases.